On the morning of January 8, 1815, 5 miles south of New Orleans, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham ordered his 8,000-strong army to attack the war-hardened American forces of General Andrew Jackson. Jackson, who declared martial law in the city of New Orleans, enlisted any able-bodied man he could find, including local businessmen, freed slaves, Choctaw Indians, and even Bayou pirates. The War of 1812, which had been going for almost 3 years by this point, was a stalemate, as neither the British or Americans had achieved a decisive victory by this point. However, the British were one victory away from capturing the vital port city of New Orleans, which would give the British significant control of the Mississippi River and hinder America's westward expansion. On Christmas Eve 1814, in the Belgian city of Ghent, a treaty was struck between the United Kingdom and the United States of America to end the War of 1812. However, this news would not reach the United States for another 6 weeks, which meant the war would continue to rage on. The British Navy had moved its focus to capturing the city of New Orleans, which served as an essential trading port at the mouth of the Mississippi. The British Navy sent 60 ships with 14,450 soldiers on board, under the command of Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane. British forces arrived at Villers Plantation on December 23, 1814, from a shallow bayou in the bordering swamps. Jacques Villers was chased out of his plantation and alerted Jackson of the British arrival. Jackson, enraged by this apparent blunder, immediately rallied his troops to face the British force. That very evening, Jackson led 2,131 troops to face the British in a sneak attack. British forces, cooking their dinner over blazing fires, were completely unsuspecting of an American incursion, when at that moment, the USS Carolina began launching deadly volleys on the British camp. American infantry, freed blacks, and Creole militia rushed down the Levee Road, while Coffee's hardened veterans moved through a swamp to outflank the British. The skirmish was initially well organized, but darkness and gun smoke caused mass confusion between the opposing forces, and the fight was quickly engulfed in hand-to-hand brutality. By midnight, the American attack had decimated the unsuspecting British camp. Noticing more British troops arriving through the bayou and unable to spare any manpower losses, Jackson withdrew his forces to the Rodriguez Canal, a 20-foot wide muddy ditch bordering the Chalmette plantation. The Americans had won this initial incursion, suffering 24 killed and 115 wounded. British losses were tallied at 46 killed and 167 wounded. Perhaps more important was the change of momentum. General Keane initially expected to take New Orleans with ease, but Jackson proved that it would be extremely hard. Watching the British fortify their position, Jackson ordered his men to do the same at the Rodriguez Canal, and by the end of December 24th, Jackson had formed a line extending 600 yards from the Mississippi to the nearby swamps. On Christmas Day, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham arrived at the British encampment, trapped between the Mississippi River, an impossible swamp, and Jackson's heavily fortified line. Furthermore, the Americans had a vitally placed cannon battery on the western side of the Mississippi River. These cannons were placed perpendicularly to destroy a potential British advance on the Rodriguez Canal. Over the following days, Pakenham tenaciously deliberated with his generals on a battle plan that could surpass the American defenses, and by January 7th, 1815, he was ready to give battle. Pakenham would send his most aggressive colonel, William Thornton, with approximately 1,400 men across the Mississippi River to engage and capture the American cannons by daybreak. Once he would capture these guns, he would then focus them on Jackson's line. Major General John Keane would lead infantry along the river to draw as much American fire as possible. Second in command, Major General Samuel Gibbs would lead the main assault on the Rodriguez Canal with 2,100 men. Simultaneously with Gibbs' advance, one of Pakenham's black regiments was ordered to draw Coffee's men into the Cypress Swamp. Major General John Lambert was to command the reserves of the British Army. On midnight, January 8, 1815, under a dense cloud of fog, the British assault on New Orleans began. Colonel Thornton commanded his troops to begin crossing the Mississippi River. However, things began to go awry for the British almost immediately. A dam that was supposed to transfer the British crossing boats into the Mississippi collapsed, delaying the British crossing to the western bank. The collapse resulted in Thornton only being able to ferry 450 of the planned 1,500 men to the other side of the river. To make things worse, Thornton did not factor the current of the Mississippi River, which resulted in his forces landing an additional 1,000 yards away from the American battery. By the time Thornton had finally crossed the river, it was nearly dawn. On the eastern bank of the Mississippi, the British 44th Regiment, tasked with carrying the breaching ladders for the attack, had forgotten them. General Gibbs, furious at this extreme lack of preparation, yelled for the ladders to be retrieved, but it was too late. Pakenham anxiously awaited Thornton's signal to press his assault, but as dawn neared, the signal never came. Pakenham had a decision to make. He could press his advance forward under the cover of fog, risking decimation if the fog lifted, or he could call off the attack. Anxious and fed up with waiting, Pakenham pressed his attack. The British advance started out quite smoothly. The entire attacking army was concealed from the Americans by the fog. Behind the Rodriguez Canal, Jackson knew the British were advancing from the sound of the British drums behind the curtain of the mist. Andrew Jackson sternly ordered his troops to keep their heads down until he gave the order. The British moved closer and closer to the American line. Suddenly, the thick curtain of fog pulled back instantly. The redcoats of the British Army immediately stood out in the open fields of Chalmette Plantation. At that exact moment, the Americans opened fire. Gibbs' advance was hit extremely hard, and without the ladders he needed to cross the canal, the British were sitting ducks. The British scored an unlikely victory on the Mississippi River bank, as Colonel Robert Rennie captured an unfortified redoubt. Rennie expected Keene's forces to rush up and reinforce him. However, Keene observed the vast devastation of the 44th Regiment on the British right and angled his 93rd Highlanders Division to assist General Gibbs. Gibbs, now fuming with anger after losing nearly all of his 21st and 44th Regiment, rode up to reorganize his troops. At the same time, Keene, who was advancing with his 93rd Highlanders, was struck in the groin and badly wounded. A few brave members of Gibbs' advance made it across the Rodriguez Canal, but either were killed or captured. Moments later, Gibbs was shot in the head and body and died on the field. Pakenham rode up to take control of what was left of his army after witnessing the slaughter unfold. He moved to the now disheveled 93rd Highlanders Division and rallied them forward. But before he could move far, Pakenham was shot in the knee and spine, critically wounding him. Before he passed away, he ordered General John Lambert to advance his reserves. In the captured redoubt, Rennie led a final assault of what was left of his infantry and was instantly shot dead. On the western bank of the Mississippi, Thornton had finally reached the American battery. He ordered a bayonet charge of his 450 men against the 1,000 American defenders and routed them. Thornton would be able to quickly reactivate the captured batteries, but he was too late for his success to have any impact. By the time Thornton took out the American batteries, the entire British command structure had been incapacitated. Lambert and his reserves had watched half of the British attacking force get mowed down, and their morale was at a breaking point. Lambert discussed shortly with Admiral Cochrane at a plantation house and ordered Thornton's men to withdraw from the eastern bank. Andrew Jackson, realizing his forces would have been easily devastated, eagerly accepted Lambert's ceasefire. The battle was disastrous for the British, suffering 828 killed and near 2,500 wounded, with approximately half of the wounded needing amputations. Jackson's men only suffered 8 killed and 14 wounded. Such a massive disparity in casualties was nearly unheard of, and with no chance of launching a second assault, the British withdrew their forces from New Orleans, ending the last major battle of the War of 1812. After this astounding victory, Jackson became elevated to a national hero, and eventually won the presidency in 1829. The Battle of New Orleans would go on to serve as a symbol of American democracy, triumphing over European entitlement and aristocracy.